The desert wind over the Tunisian valley of El Guetar carried the sharp, metallic taste of dust and impending violence. It was the morning of Tuesday, March 23, 1943. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. stood on a rocky observation post, his binoculars pressed against his eyes, scanning the arid landscape below. The heat was already rising, shimmering off the hardpan floor of the valley where the wreckage of the previous days still smoldered. Below him, the United States Army was about to face a test that would determine the trajectory of the war in North Africa. For weeks, the American forces had been battered, demoralized, and humiliated, particularly at the disaster of Kasserine Pass just the month before. But the man standing on the ridge had changed the chemical composition of the atmosphere. Since assuming command of the Tuan Corps on March 6th, Patton had transformed a broken unit into a coiled spring. He had imposed strict discipline, fining soldiers for unpolished boots and missing neckties, even in the sweltering heat, enforcing a rigidity that many hated, but which restored the necessary structure of a fighting force. Now, the German 10th Panzer Division was advancing. This was not a drill or a skirmish against rearguard Italians. These were seasoned veterans of the Wehrmacht, operating heavy armor with the precision that had conquered Europe. The rumble of the engines grew louder, a low-frequency vibration that could be felt in the chest before the tanks were fully visible through the haze. Patton watched as the German columns maneuvered, expecting the Americans to break as they had done before. But the lines held. The American artillery, positioned with exacting care under Patton's directive, opened fire. The valley floor erupted in geysers of sand and shrapnel. The coordination between the infantry and the artillery was tight, disciplined, and lethal. As the German tanks took direct hits and the infantry assault withered under the concentrated fire, a grin spread across Patton's face. He turned to his aide and famously remarked on the nature of battle, a moment where the chaos of war coalesced into a terrible kind of clarity. The Americans did not run. They fought with a ferocity that stunned the German commanders. By the time the sun began to dip below the western ridges, the 10th Panzer Division was in retreat, leaving behind the burning hulks of their machines. The ghost of Kasserine Pass had been exorcised. Welcome to the story of a deception so vast and a strategic gamble so audacious that it redefined the art of warfare. This is not just the story of a general, but of a psychological duel played out across the English Channel, where the reputation of one man was weaponized to freeze an entire army in place. This is the story of how the Allies turned their greatest liability into their most potent secret weapon. Following the victory at El Guetar, the legend of Patton began to permeate the German high command. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, had already noted the shift in American tactics. The intelligence reports flowing back to Berlin described a new commander, one who favored rapid, aggressive armored thrusts, and who possessed an almost reckless disregard for flanks in favor of forward momentum. To the German military mind, which prided itself on the principles of blitzkrieg, Patton was the most understandable of the Allied generals. He fought like they did. He understood the value of speed and the psychological impact of armor. While they respected British General Bernard Montgomery for his methodical preparation, they feared Patton for his unpredictability. This fear would become the cornerstone of the greatest trick ever played on the Third Reich. The theater of war shifted north across the Mediterranean to the rugged island of Sicily. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, launched on July 10, 1943. It was a massive amphibious undertaking, but it quickly devolved into a contest of egos between Patton and Montgomery. The original plan called for Patton's 7th Army to play a supporting role, guarding Montgomery's left flank as the British Eighth Army drove up the east coast toward the port of Messina to cut off the German retreat. But the terrain and stiff German resistance bogged Montgomery down near the slopes of Mount Etna. Patton, refusing to remain stationary, saw an opportunity to demonstrate the superior mobility of American forces. Without explicit authorization to change the primary strategic objective, he launched a lightning drive toward the west, aiming for the capital city of Palermo. The advance was relentless. Patton drove his men through the blistering Sicilian summer, where temperatures regularly soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The roads were narrow, dusty tracks that wound through mountainous terrain, perfect for defensive ambushes. Yet, the Seventh Army moved with a speed that defied logistical expectations. They captured Palermo on July 22nd, just 12 days after landing. The psychological blow to the Axis forces was immense. The newsreels back home hailed Patton as a conquering hero, a modern-day Caesar riding through the liberated streets. But the real prize was Messina, the gateway to the Italian mainland. Patton turned his army east, entering a grueling race against Montgomery to reach the city first. The fighting along the northern coast was brutal, characterized by amphibious end runs and savage engagements for control of hilltop villages. On August 17, 1943, Patton's patrol entered Messina just hours before the British. He had won the race, cementing his reputation as the Allies' premier offensive commander. However, beneath the laurels of victory, a fracture was forming that would threaten to derail his entire career. The stress of continuous combat was taking a toll on the men, and Patton, a man who viewed shell shock as a failure of will rather than a medical condition, was about to cross a line. On the afternoon of August 3, 1943, Patton visited the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia. He moved through the tent, pinning Purple Hearts on soldiers with visible, gruesome injuries, men with missing limbs, bandaged heads, and chests torn open by shrapnel. He spoke kindly to them, his voice thick with emotion. Then he came upon Private Charles H. Cool, who was sitting on a box, appearing physically uninjured. When Patton asked him where he was hurt, Cool replied that he was essentially exhausted, saying, "I guess I just can't take it." The switch in Patton's demeanor was instantaneous. The compassion vanished, replaced by a volcanic rage. He slapped Cool across the face with his gloves, grabbed him by the collar, and threw him out of the tent, shouting that he would not have a yellow-bellied bastard stinking up a place of honor for brave men. The medical staff stood in stunned silence. Patton ordered that Cool be sent back to the front immediately. Unknown to Patton at the time, Cool was suffering from malaria and a high fever, diagnosed later that day. A week later, on August 10th, the scenario repeated itself at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. Patton encountered Private Paul G. Bennett, who was shivering on a cot. Bennett explained that his nerves were shot and he could not stand the shelling anymore. Patton, enraged once again by what he perceived as cowardice, slapped the soldier hard across the face. As Bennett began to cry, Patton struck him again, shouting, "Your nerves, hell! You are just a goddamn coward!" He then reached for the ivory-handled revolver at his hip, threatening to shoot the man right there to save him the trouble of waiting for the Germans. The hospital commander, Colonel Donald Currier, had to physically intervene to separate the general from the private. The incidents were suppressed initially, but the rumors spread like wildfire through the ranks. The medical corps was outraged. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, received the reports, he was placed in an impossible position. He knew Patton was indispensable as a combat commander. He was the only general the Germans truly feared. Yet, his conduct was indefensible and threatened the morale of the citizen army the United States had fielded. Eisenhower wrote a severe reprimand, ordering Patton to apologize to the soldiers, the medical staff, and the troops. Patton, humbled and shaken, complied. He went from unit to unit, standing on makeshift stages, delivering awkward apologies to the men he had led. The story broke in the United States on November 20, 1943, when journalist Drew Pearson broadcast the details of the slapping incidents on his radio show. The public reaction was mixed, but leaned heavily toward outrage. Members of Congress called for Patton's court-martial. Parents of drafted soldiers wrote furious letters demanding his removal. Eisenhower, however, decided to retain him, arguing that Patton's value to the war effort outweighed his indiscretions. But as punishment, and to let the heat die down, Patton was relieved of command of the 7th Army. He was sent to a villa in Palermo, and later to Cairo, and then to England, placed in a sort of professional purgatory. For a man who lived for the spotlight and the adrenaline of the front line, this was a fate worse than death. He watched from the sidelines as his subordinate, Omar Bradley, was promoted over him to lead the American ground forces for the upcoming invasion of Europe. While Patton languished in exile, a different conversation was happening in Berlin. The German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, received intelligence regarding Patton's removal. They analyzed the reports with typical Teutonic skepticism. To Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief in the West, and the analysts at Fremde Heere West, the idea that the Americans would sideline their most brilliant and aggressive general simply because he slapped a private was laughable. It did not compute with their understanding of military hierarchy. In the Wehrmacht, discipline was harsh, and a general striking a soldier for cowardice might be viewed as excessive, but certainly not grounds for dismissal. The Germans concluded that the slapping incident and the subsequent public outcry were a smokescreen. They believed it was a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to hide Patton's movements. If the Americans were announcing that Patton was in disgrace and nowhere near the front, it must mean he was secretly preparing for a massive strike. They reasoned that no army would voluntarily bench its best player before the most critical match of the war. Thus, the seed of the Great Deception was planted not by Allied intelligence, but by the Germans' own inability to understand the democratic sensibilities of the American military. By early 1944, the planning for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, was well underway. The Allies faced a daunting problem: the Atlantic Wall. Hitler had fortified the coast of France, and the Germans were waiting. The most logical place for an invasion was the Pas-de-Calais. It was the shortest route across the English Channel, offering the quickest turnaround for ships and the best air cover range. The beaches were flat and suitable for armor, and the path to Germany was direct. The Germans knew this. They had concentrated their strongest fighting force, the 15th Army, in the Pas-de-Calais sector. To succeed in Normandy, the Allies needed to convince the Germans that the attack would indeed come at Calais, and that any landing in Normandy was merely a diversion. This gave birth to Operation Fortitude South. The centerpiece of this deception was the creation of a phantom army, the First United States Army Group, or FUSAG. This army existed only on paper, in radio waves, and in the minds of German intelligence officers. But to make it real, it needed a commander. It needed a name that would command respect and fear. There was only one choice. Eisenhower summoned Patton from his exile. Patton arrived in England in January 1944, eager to redeem himself. He was given command of the Third Army, which was a real combat formation training for the later stages of the campaign. But his public role was to be the commander of FUSAG. He was stationed in the southeast of England, in Kent, directly across the channel from the Pas-de-Calais. His presence was deliberately leaked. Agents controlled by the British double-cross system fed information to Berlin that Patton had arrived in Dover. He was seen visiting local towns, inspecting troops, and attending civic functions. Every appearance was calculated to reinforce the narrative. Patton is here, therefore the invasion is coming from here. The deception was elaborate. The fields of Kent were filled with inflatable rubber tanks that looked real from aerial reconnaissance altitudes. Canvas aircraft were parked on fake airfields. Wooden landing craft floated in the estuaries. A dense network of radio traffic was generated, simulating the communications of a massive army group preparing for an assault. Signal Corps units drove around the countryside, transmitting orders for non-existent divisions, creating a frantic electronic signature that German listening posts across the channel eagerly intercepted. Patton played his part, though he chafed at the inactivity. He was a man of action, forced to be an actor. On April 25, 1944, he nearly ruined everything again. Speaking at the opening of a welcome club in Knutsford, he made unscripted remarks about the destiny of the British and Americans. And he added, the Russians, to rule the post-war world. The press omitted the mention of the Russians, and the headlines screamed that Patton had insulted the Soviet allies. The political fallout was immediate. Eisenhower was furious and seriously considered sending Patton home for good. Patton wrote in his diary of his despair, feeling that his career was over, that he was destined to be a failure. But once again, Eisenhower relented. The value of Patton as a decoy was too high. He was kept on, but the leash was tightened. As May 1944 turned to June, the tension in England was palpable. The massive staging areas were packed with men and material. In the southeast, the phantom army of FUSAG continued its silent pantomime. The Germans were completely sold. Their situational maps in Berchtesgaden showed the 1st U.S. Army Group poised in Kent, numbering dozens of divisions, waiting for the order to cross the Strait of Dover. They believed that the invasion of Normandy, if it came, would be a feint to draw the German reserves away from Calais, opening the door for Patton's crushing blow. Adolf Hitler, relying on the assessments of his generals and the reliable intelligence from their compromised spy network, kept the powerful 15th Army locked in the Pas-de-Calais. These were panzer divisions and infantry units that could have thrown the Normandy invaders back into the sea. But they sat idle, scanning the horizon for a fleet that would never arrive, commanded by a general who was actually sitting in a manor house miles away, fuming over his exclusion from the first wave. The weather in the Channel began to deteriorate. Gale-force winds and driving rain battered the coast. The German Meteorological Service predicted that no invasion could possibly launch in such conditions. Rommel, confident that the Allies would wait for a break in the weather, left his headquarters to celebrate his wife's birthday in Germany. Other commanders left for war games in Rhine. The vigilance of the Atlantic Wall relaxed slightly. The sentries huddled against the wind, eyes turned toward the churning gray water. In England, the decision was made. Eisenhower, after agonizing over the weather reports, uttered the phrase, "Okay, let's go." The vast machinery of Operation Overlord began to move. But for Patton, the waiting continued. He was the ghost in the machine, the visible threat that had to remain visible. His role was to do nothing, to be seen doing nothing, and to let the Germans believe that the real hammer had not yet fallen. As the paratroopers boarded their C-47s and the soldiers climbed into the landing craft, the night of June 5th settled over the Channel. The greatest armada in history was setting sail for Normandy. But across the water, the German radar operators and intelligence officers were still looking east, toward Dover, toward Patton. They were waiting for the ghost general to lead the main attack. The success of the invasion hung on a razor's edge, dependent on how long the Germans would cling to their belief in the Phantom Army. If they realized the truth too early, if they moved the 15th Army south to Normandy in the first critical hours, the Allies would face a slaughter. Patton sat in his quarters, the sound of the rain against the window pane echoing the turbulence in his own mind. He was the greatest warrior the United States had produced, yet his contribution to the most important day of the war was his absence. He was a tiger in a cage, used as a scarecrow. The hours ticked by. The ships cut through the dark water. The world held its breath. The deception was complete, but the reaction of the enemy was yet to be seen. The dawn was coming, and with it, the revelation of whether the ghost of Patton had truly haunted Hitler enough to save the invasion. The telegrams from the double agents had been sent. The radio signals were chirping their lies. The stage was set. Now, the dying and the killing would begin, while the ghost army stood watch over the empty cliffs of Dover. The dawn of June 6, 1944, shattered the silence of the Normandy coast. But for the German High Command, the roar of the guns at Omaha and Utah beaches was merely a prelude. As the Allies clawed a foothold into the damp gray sands of France, the eyes of the Wehrmacht leadership remained fixed intently on the Pas-de-Calais, over 150 miles to the northeast. Even as reports of paratroopers dropping into Sainte-Mère-Église and gliders crashing into the Orne River bridgeheads flooded into Berlin, the conviction held firm. This was the diversion. The real blow, the hammer stroke delivered by the legendary General George S. Patton and his 1st United States Army Group, was yet to fall. The Ghost Army in Kent, built of rubber and radio waves, held the powerful German 15th Army in a paralyzed trance, guarding an empty coastline against an enemy that did not exist. Weeks bled into a month, and the war in Normandy transformed from a beach assault into a grinding, claustrophobic nightmare. The Allies had advanced, but they had slammed into the Bocage, the ancient hedgerow country of the Cotentin Peninsula. This was not the open terrain suitable for armored maneuver. It was a checkerboard of small fields enclosed by earth banks, 4 feet high, topped with thick tangles of hawthorn and bramble. The sunken roads between them became kill zones. German paratroopers and SS Panzer divisions turned every field into a fortress, digging into the roots of the hedges, pre-sighting their mortars and machine guns on the choke points. The advance was measured in yards, paid for in exorbitant casualties. The British were bogged down around Caen, facing the bulk of the German armor, while the Americans hacked their way south towards Saint-Lô. To the frustration of the Allied commanders, the stalemate seemed unbreakable. But to the Germans, this slow progress confirmed their suspicions. The Allies were struggling because they had not yet committed their main force. The Patton Army was still in England. Intelligence briefings in the Wolf's Lair continued to emphasize the threat to Calais. As late as July, Field Marshal Rommel and Field Marshal von Kluge were denied the release of the reserve panzer divisions stationed in the north. They were desperate for reinforcements to throw the invaders back into the sea, but Hitler, haunted by the specter of Patton, refused to move them. He would not expose the Third Reich's back door to the American general he feared most. While the infantry bled in the hedgerows, the man responsible for Hitler's hesitation was pacing the floor of his trailer in England, consumed by a potent mix of vanity and despair. George Patton was watching history unfold without him. He wrote letters to his wife, Beatrice, expressing his terrified conviction that the war would end before he could get into it. He felt like a racehorse locked in the stable while the derby was being run. Finally, the order came. On July 6, 1944, Patton flew secretly to France. There were no newsreels, no parades. He arrived at a clandestine airstrip near Omaha Beach, his presence strictly classified. He was driven to a concealed bivouac in the apple orchards of the Nehu district, where he waited for the Third Army to be activated. He was a general without a command, a ghost haunting the rear echelon, critiquing the cautious tactics of his peers and champing at the bit to demonstrate the violence of movement. The breakout, when it finally came, was born of fire. Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944. The plan, devised by General Omar Bradley, called for a massive aerial bombardment to rupture the German lines west of St. Lo, creating a gap for the armor to flood through. The scale of the violence was apocalyptic. Thousands of Allied bombers carpeted a narrow rectangle of the front with high explosives. The earth shook for miles. The elite Panzer Lehr Division, positioned directly in the path of the bombing, was effectively erased from the order of battle. Tanks were flipped like toys, bunkers collapsed under the concussion. The landscape was churned into a moonscape of craters and dust. In the confusion and smoke of the following days, the American First Army began to push through the breach. The German line, brittle and overstretched, snapped. This was the moment. On Tuesday, August 1, 1944, at 12:00 p.m., the 3rd United States Army became operational. The Ghost stepped out of the shadows and onto the battlefield. Patton assumed command of the 8th Corps on the right flank and the newly arrived 5th Dexec and 38th Corps. The deception was over. The reality was about to begin. Patton did not just attack. He exploded into the French countryside. While Montgomery and the British were engaged in a deliberate, methodical battle of attrition to the east, Patton's philosophy was simple: haul ass and bypass. He ordered his tank commanders to ignore their flanks, a directive that terrified traditional military strategists. He believed that speed itself was armor. If you moved fast enough, the enemy could not traverse their guns to hit you. If you kept moving, they could not reorganize to counterattack. He famously told his corps commanders that he did not want them to worry about the enemy holding the line. He wanted them to worry about running out of gas. The speed of the Third Army's advance was unprecedented in the history of warfare. In the first week of August, Patton's columns tore into Brittany, capturing the vital ports. But his eyes were set on the open plains to the east, toward Paris and the Seine. He directed the 15th Corps to turn 90 degrees and drive east, slicing across the rear of the German 7th Army. It was a maneuver of breathtaking audacity. The German commanders, struggling to maintain communications with their shattered units, were receiving reports that made no sense. American tanks were reported in towns that were supposed to be 40 miles behind the front line. Convoys of German supply trucks were being ambushed by armored reconnaissance units deep in their own rear areas. The psychological impact on the Wehrmacht was devastating. For months, they had waited for Patton to land at Calais. Now they realized with dawning horror that he was already behind them, tearing out their logistical heart. The Patton Ghost was no longer a threat across the water. It was a fire-breathing reality rampaging through their supply lines. The rigidity of the German command structure, which required approval from Hitler for major withdrawals, became their death warrant. As Patton's tanks raced eastward, capturing Le Mans on August 8th and angling north toward Alençon, the German 7th Army was still fighting hard against the British and Canadians in the north and the U.S. First Army in the west. They were being boxed in. Hitler, looking at maps in East Prussia that bore little resemblance to the chaotic reality on the ground, ordered a counterattack. Operation Lüttich, launched on August 7 toward Mortagne, was designed to cut off Patton's breakthrough and reach the sea at Avranches. It was a suicide mission. The German panzers, depleted and lacking air cover, drove west into the teeth of American anti-tank defenses and the relentless attacks of Typhoon fighter bombers. Patton, sensing the desperation of the move, simply ignored it. He reinforced the shoulder of the breakthrough and ordered his spearheads to keep driving east and then north. He saw the opportunity for a double envelopment, a canne of massive proportions. By mid-August, the trap was visible on the map. The Canadians were pushing south toward Falaise, and Patton's 15th Corps was driving north toward Argenton. Between them lay the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, tens of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles, squeezed into a shrinking pocket. Patton, energized by the momentum, urged General Bradley to let him close the gap completely. He declared he could drive the British into the sea for another Dunkirk if allowed to cross the inter-army boundary line. Bradley, fearful of friendly fire incidents between the converging Allied armies, ordered Patton to halt at Argenton. Patton raged, arguing that the delay was letting the Germans escape, but he obeyed. Inside the Falaise pocket, the conditions were hellish. As the gap narrowed to a few miles, the retreating German columns were forced onto a handful of roads. The Allied air forces, ruling the skies with absolute impunity, descended like vultures. Fighter bombers strafed the jammed roads, turning trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and tanks into blazing pyres. The smell of burning rubber, rotting flesh, and cordite hung heavy over the lush Norman countryside. It became known as the Corridor of Death. German soldiers, disciplined veterans who had conquered Europe, abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot through the forests, terrified by the relentless pursuit. On August 19th, the gap was finally closed when American and Polish forces linked up near Chambois. The destruction inside the pocket was absolute. The German 7th Army effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Over 10,000 dead soldiers lay amidst the wreckage, and 50,000 were taken prisoner. The roads were so choked with destroyed equipment that bulldozers had to clear paths for the Allied advance. Pilots flying over the area reported that the stench of death was sickening even at 2,000 feet. Patton did not pause to count the dead. He was already looking east, toward the Seine, toward the Meuse, toward the Rhine. The Third Army was in full pursuit mode. The dash across France that followed was a blur of motion. Towns were liberated in minutes. Tank columns drove 60 miles in a single day. The inhabitants of villages would hear the rumble of engines, expecting the return of the Wehrmacht, only to see the white stars on the olive-drab Shermans and the dust-covered, goggled faces of the Americans. They threw flowers and wine, but the Americans barely stopped, waving as they roared past, chasing the retreating enemy. The logistical strain of this advance was immense. The Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system, was established to shuttle fuel and ammunition from the Normandy beaches to the racing front. It was a lifeline of gasoline, operating 24 hours a day, driven by men who were pushed to the brink of exhaustion. But even this effort struggled to keep pace with Patton's thirst for fuel. His tanks were consuming hundreds of thousands of gallons a day. By late August, the Third Army had crossed the Seine. Paris was liberated on August 25th, though Patton bypassed the city to avoid getting bogged down in urban fighting and ceremonies. He wanted the German border. He wanted to end the war by Christmas. The German resistance in France had collapsed. There was a vacuum in the West, a gaping hole in the defenses of the Third Reich. Patton's intelligence officers reported that there was nothing between them and the Siegfried Line, but scattered, demoralized remnants of infantry. The road to Germany seemed wide open. However, the rapid success brought a new kind of conflict, political and strategic. The Allied supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. There was not enough fuel to support the simultaneous advances of Montgomery in the north and Patton in the south. A choice had to be made. Eisenhower and the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHEF, faced a dilemma. Put all the resources behind Montgomery for a thrust into the Ruhr, or back Patton for a drive into the Saar. On August 30th, the gas gauges in the Third Army's tanks began to hit empty. The forward momentum that had carried them across France, that had broken the back of the Wehrmacht in the west and terrified the German high command, began to sputter. Patton's vanguards were within striking distance of the German border, occupying the high ground near the Moselle River. They could see the defensible terrain of the Reich ahead, but the fuel trucks were not arriving. The orders coming down from SHAF were prioritizing the northern sector. Patton stood in his headquarters, looking at the situation map. The thick red lines of his advance arrowed straight toward the heart of Germany. He knew, with the instinct of a predator, that the enemy was reeling, unhinged, and vulnerable. He knew that a pause now would give the Germans the one thing they needed most: time. Time to regroup, time to dig in, time to man the formidable fortifications of the Siegfried Line. The ghost of Patton had terrified them, chased them, and broken them. But now, the machine of war was failing the man who drove it. As the sun set on the last day of August 1944, the engines of the Third Army fell silent. The tanks sat motionless on the roads. The silence was heavier than the roar of battle. Across the river, in the gathering gloom, the Germans were digging. The sounds of shovels striking earth and the clanking of tracks echoed in the distance. They were fortifying the border. The window of opportunity, pried open by sheer audacity and speed, was beginning to close. And George Patton, the man who feared nothing but a halt, realized he was about to face his most formidable enemy yet: the logistics of his own success. The race was over. The siege was about to begin. The ghost was no longer hunting. It was waiting. And in the distance, the winter clouds were gathering. The silence that fell over the Third Army on September 1st, 1944, was deafening. After weeks of roaring engines and the concussive thunder of the blitzkrieg in reverse, the sudden stillness on the banks of the Meuse River felt like a physical weight. The fuel gauges on the Sherman tanks read empty. The jerry cans strapped to the rear decks were dry. The most mobile and lethal force the United States had ever fielded, a force that had torn the heart out of the German defense in France, was paralyzed not by enemy fire, but by the logistics of its own success. Lieutenant General George S. Patton watched helplessly as the horizon remained tauntingly clear. His forward reconnaissance units had reported that the road to the Rhine was open. The German armies ahead were in disarray. Fleeing in stolen cars and horse-drawn carts, their heavy equipment abandoned in the ditches of France. But Patton could not pursue. He was tethered to the ground, a chained tiger, while the enemy was granted the one thing they could not buy with blood: time. This period became known as the Great Stop, and it remains one of the most controversial chapters of the war. The Allied supply lines, stretching all the way back to the improvised harbors of Normandy, had snapped under the strain. There was simply not enough gasoline to feed the voracious appetites of both Patton's Third Army in the south and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the north. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, facing intense political pressure and swayed by Montgomery's promise of a decisive thrust into the German industrial heartland, made the fateful decision. The bulk of the supplies, the precious tonnage of fuel and ammunition, would be diverted north for Operation Market Garden. Patton was ordered to halt. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic for the Third Army. As Patton fumed in his headquarters, resorting to sending officers to hijack fuel trucks from other units in acts of desperate insubordination, the Germans were performing a miracle. The miracle of the West, they called it. The shattered remnants of the Wehrmacht, given a reprieve from the relentless American pursuit, flowed back across the German border. They reached the West Wall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, a formidable belt of bunkers, tank traps, and pillboxes that had been neglected since 1940. Now, with the Americans stalled, the Germans reactivated the defenses. Old men and teenage boys were conscripted to dig trenches. Panzer divisions were refitted. The door that had been wide open was slammed shut and bolted. When the fuel finally began to trickle back into Patton's sector in late September and October, the war had changed. The season of movement was over. The season of mud had begun. The Third Army was no longer chasing a fleeing enemy across open fields. They were facing a dug-in, desperate adversary fighting on their own soil. The campaign turned into a grueling, WWI-style slog of attrition. The focal point of this misery was the ancient fortress city of Metz. Metz was a nightmare of military engineering, a cluster of heavy forts ringing the city, designed to withstand siege warfare. Patton, eager to regain his momentum, threw his corps against it. But the autumn rains arrived with a vengeance, turning the Lorraine region into a quagmire. Tanks sank to their turrets in the clay. Infantrymen suffered from trench foot as foxholes filled with freezing water. The Americans assaulted the forts, like Fort Dryant, only to be met with withering machine gun fire and artillery barrages from concrete casemates that were impervious to standard tank shells. It was a bloody, yard-by-yard struggle that tested the morale of the Third Army to its breaking point. The Lightning War was a distant memory. This was a war of grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonets in the dark, wet forests. Patton was criticized for his obsession with Metz, but he argued that he could not leave such a strong point in his rear. It took until mid-December for the city to finally fall, the first time it had been taken by force since 451 AD. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The Third Army was exhausted, battered, and depleted. They needed rest. They needed to refit. But history had other plans. On the morning of Saturday, December 16th, 1944, a ghostly mist hung over the Ardennes forest, a quiet sector of the front north of Patton's position, held by inexperienced American divisions sent there to acclimate. At 05:30, the silence was shattered by the roar of 1,600 German artillery pieces. Out of the fog and the snow emerged 3 German armies, the desperate last gamble of Adolf Hitler. Operation Watch on the Rhine had begun. The goal was to split the Allied armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The American lines buckled. Panic spread through the rear areas. Rumors of German paratroopers disguised as MPs and SS Panzer columns cutting through the countryside threw the Allied command into confusion. This became the Battle of the Bulge. While the northern sector collapsed and General Eisenhower scrambled to contain the disaster, Patton was in his headquarters in Nancy. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been tracking a massive buildup of German reserves behind the line for weeks. Unlike other Allied intelligence, which dismissed the buildup as a defensive measure, Koch and Patton suspected a counteroffensive. Quietly, without orders, Patton had begun to prepare. He had his staff draft contingency plans for a sudden withdrawal from the Saar region and a pivot north. It was a premonition born of his deep study of history and his understanding of the German military mind. On December 19th, Eisenhower called a summit of the senior Allied commanders at Verdun. The atmosphere in the damp, drafty barracks was grim. The scale of the German breakthrough was now apparent. The 101st Airborne Division was encircled at the crucial road junction of Bastogne, cut off and surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces. The Germans were driving toward the Meuse. Eisenhower walked into the room, his face gray with fatigue. He looked at his generals, Bradley, Devers, Patton, and tried to set a tone of forced optimism. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster, he said. There will be only cheerful faces at this table. Eisenhower then turned to Patton. He knew asking the Third Army to help was a logistical nightmare. Patton was fully engaged in an offensive of his own to the east, hundreds of miles away from the Ardennes sector. To help, he would have to break contact with the enemy, turn his entire army 90 degrees, and march north through a blizzard into the flank of the German advance. It was a maneuver that military textbooks deemed impossible to execute rapidly. "George," Eisenhower asked, "how long will it take you to reorient your forces and attack the southern flank of the Bulge?" The room went silent. The other generals expected Patton to say a week, perhaps 4 days, if he pushed his men to the limit. Patton leaned forward, a small cigar clamped in his teeth, his eyes narrowing. "I can attack on the morning of December 22nd, he said. A collective gasp went through the room. It was December 19th. He was promising to move 3 divisions, tens of thousands of men, thousands of tanks and trucks, over icy roads, in zero-visibility weather, and launch a coordinated assault in 48 hours. "Don't be fatuous, George," Eisenhower snapped, clearly irritated. He thought Patton was boasting, making a grandstand play in the middle of a crisis. "This is no time for boasting. I need a realistic estimate." Patton stood up. "I'm not boasting, Ike. I've already prepared the orders. My staff has been working on this for 3 days. I have 3 divisions ready to move. I can attack with the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry. I will be in Bastogne by Christmas." The shock in the room shifted to awe. While the rest of the Allied command had been reacting to the German surprise, Patton had been anticipating it. Eisenhower gave the nod. "Go," he said. What followed was one of the most complex and brilliant maneuvers in the history of warfare. Patton left the conference and telephoned his headquarters. His code word to initiate the movement was simple: "Play ball." Instantly, the Third Army began to rotate. It was a logistical ballet of immense complexity performed in a blinding snowstorm. Divisional columns had to cross each other's paths without creating gridlock. Supply depots had to be moved. Artillery had to be limbered up and dragged over frozen roads. The temperature plummeted to 0. Men lacked winter camouflage. They improvised by painting their helmets with white lime and draping bed sheets over their uniforms. The Germans, intercepting the radio traffic, were baffled. They saw the Third Army disengaging from the Saar front, but assumed Patton was retreating to cover his own flank. They could not conceive that he was turning to attack them. They still believed, arrogantly, that an army of that size could not pivot so quickly. They were wrong. The ghost of Patton was coming for them, and this time he was coming from a direction they deemed impossible. As the columns of the Third Army marched north, the conditions were apocalyptic. The roads were sheets of black ice. Trucks slid into ditches. Tanks had to be guided by men walking ahead with flashlights. The wind cut through the soldiers' overcoats. But Patton was everywhere. He rode in his open jeep, his face purple from the cold, urging the men on. "Faster!" he yelled. "We've got to get to those bastards in Bastogne." He fined men for not wearing their helmets, even in the blizzard, maintaining that discipline was the only thing that would keep them alive. He knew that speed was the only thing that mattered. Every hour they delayed was another hour the paratroopers in Bastogne had to hold out against the panzers. Inside Bastogne, the situation was dire. The 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, were surrounded, outgunned, and running low on ammunition and medical supplies. They were being pounded by German artillery and assaulted by waves of infantry. On December 22nd, the day Patton had promised to attack, the German commander sent a demand for surrender to the American garrison. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's response was a single word: "Nuts." The message was relayed to Patton. He laughed, but the humor was grim. He knew that bravado wouldn't stop tanks. He needed to break the ring of steel around the town. The 3rd Army's 3 Corps, led by the 4th Armored Division, slammed into the German southern flank on the morning of the 22nd, right on schedule. The fighting was savage. The Germans had set up defensive screens south of Bastogne, mining the roads and positioning 80 8mm anti-tank guns in the tree lines. The American tanks had to fight uphill, on ice, against an enemy that knew they were coming. For days, the battle raged. The weather remained terrible, grounding the Allied Air Force. Patton, a devoutly religious man in his own eccentric way, called his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill. He ordered him to write a prayer for good weather. "I want a prayer to stop this rain," Patton demanded. "If we don't get air cover, those boys in Bastogne are done for." The chaplain wrote the prayer, and Patton had it printed on thousands of cards and distributed to the troops. He knelt in a church in Luxembourg and prayed to the God of battles, asking for 4 days of clear skies. On December 23rd, the skies miraculously cleared. The sun shone on the snow-covered Ardennes. The roar of engines filled the air, but this time it was from above. P-47, Thunderbolts, and C-47 transport planes swarmed the sky. They dropped supplies to the starving defenders of Bastogne and unleashed hell on the German panzers blocking Patton's path. The 3rd Army surged forward. By Christmas Eve, the spearhead of the 4th Armored Division was only a few miles from Bastogne. But the Germans, realizing the danger, threw everything they had at Patton's flank. They launched desperate counterattacks to sever the relief column. The village of Chaumont changed hands 3 times in one day. The snow was stained black with oil and red with blood. Patton's men were fighting without sleep, fueled by adrenaline and the knowledge that 10,000 of their brothers were depending on them. On the outskirts of Bastogne, the paratroopers heard the distant rumble of gunfire to the south. It was a different sound than the German guns. It was the flat crack of American high-velocity 76mm cannons. Hope, fragile and freezing, began to rise. But the corridor was still closed. The Germans had positioned a blocking force of heavy tanks and infantry in the village of Assenois, directly in the path of the relief column. Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored, looked at the village. The sun was setting on December 26th. He knew that standard tactics would take too long. He keyed his radio. "We're going in," he said. "Do not stop for anything." He ordered his tanks to charge the village at full speed, firing their machine guns and cannons wildly to suppress the enemy. It was a cavalry charge in 30-ton steel beasts. The column roared forward, tracks churning the snow. They smashed through the German roadblocks, crushing anti-tank guns under their treads. The Germans, stunned by the ferocity of the assault, scattered. The American tanks broke through the village and raced up the hill toward the defensive perimeter of the 101st. At 4:50 p.m. on December 26, 1944, The lead tank of the relief column, a Sherman named Cobra King, spotted a foxhole in the snow. A helmeted head popped up. It was a paratrooper from the 101st. The tank commander popped his hatch. The connection was made. The siege of Bastogne was broken. But as the news flashed back to headquarters and the world celebrated the relief of the battered paratroopers, Patton did not celebrate. He looked at the maps. The corridor he had opened was narrow, barely wide enough for a truck. The Germans were still there, massed on both sides, angry and wounded. The Bulge had been punctured, but the beast was not dead. And deep in the heavy woods to the east, the intelligence reports were picking up a new sound, the grinding tracks of the heaviest armor the Third Reich possessed. The SS Panzer divisions were regrouping. They were not retreating. They were turning their turrets south toward the long exposed flank of the Third Army. The rescue mission was over. The battle for survival was just beginning. Patton stared out at the frozen landscape, the steam of his breath mingling with the cigar smoke. He had saved the 101st, but he had placed his own army in the jaws of the enemy. The sky was turning gray again. The clear weather was ending. And out in the dark, the white-painted tigers were waiting. The corridor of snow and frozen mud that connected the 4th Armored Division to the besieged paratroopers in Bastogne was tenuous, a fragile artery pulsating with the lifeblood of an army refusing to die. It was December 27th, 1944. The siege was technically broken, but the battle was far from over. The German High Command, furious at the puncture of their encirclement, redirected the fury of their remaining panzer divisions against the narrow neck of the American breakthrough. For days, the fighting raged with a ferocity that rivaled the worst meat grinders of the First World War. Patton, operating on little sleep and fueled by a manic energy, prowled the front lines. He understood what the Germans did not. The Battle of the Bulge had been their last gasp. By committing their strategic reserves to a gambler's offensive in the Ardennes, they had stripped the defenses of the Reich bare. The Third Army was not just holding the line. It was preparing to strangle the last breath out of the Wehrmacht. As January 1945 brought colder winds and deeper snows, the Bulge was slowly flattened. The Americans and British pushed the Germans back to the starting line of the offensive. But Patton was not interested in merely restoring the status quo. He was looking at the map of the Saar-Palatinate region, the triangle of land between the Moselle, the Saar, and the Rhine rivers. Intelligence reports indicated that the German 1st and 7th Armies were regrouping there, digging in behind the formidable fortifications of the Siegfried Line. Conventional military wisdom dictated a frontal assault, a bloody battering ram against concrete pillboxes. Patton, however, saw the geometry of a slaughter. In February and early March, while the rest of the Allied leadership was fixated on the north, Patton unleashed a campaign of operational brilliance that is often overshadowed by D-Day, but was arguably his masterpiece. Working in tandem with General Alexander Patch's 7th Army, Patton orchestrated a massive double envelopment. He sent his armored columns slicing through the Eifel Mountains, terrain the Prussian military manuals deemed impassable for tanks. The Third Army moved with such speed and violence that German command and control completely collapsed. The Palatinate campaign was a clinic in modern mobile warfare. Patton's forces did not stop to reduce strong points. They bypassed them, cutting supply lines and surrounding entire divisions. The Germans, expecting a methodical advance, found American Shermans in their rear areas before they had even loaded their artillery. By mid-March, the Wehrmacht in the west was disintegrating. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered daily, emerging from the woods with hands raised, terrified by the relentless pace of the ghost general. The triangle was cleared. The German 1st and 7th Armies had virtually ceased to exist, losing over 300,000 men in dead, wounded, and captured. The road to the Rhine, the mystical barrier of the German fatherland, was open. The Rhine River was more than a physical obstacle. It was the psychological moat of the Third Reich. Crossing it meant the invasion of Germany proper. To the north, Field Marshal Montgomery was meticulously preparing Operation Plunder, a colossal endeavor involving massive artillery barrages, an airborne drop of 2 divisions, and weeks of stockpiling. It was scheduled for March 23, 1945. Patton, driven by his intense rivalry with the Briton, was determined to beat him across. He wanted to demonstrate that American audacity could achieve what British caution could not. On the night of March 22, 1945, without aerial bombardment, without artillery preparation, and without the fanfare of the press, the 5th Infantry Division of the Third Army slipped boats into the dark waters of the Rhine at Oppenheim. The Germans, lulled into complacency by the lack of preparatory fire, were caught sleeping. The Americans paddled silently across the swift current. When the first boots hit the eastern bank, there was a brief, sharp exchange of gunfire. But the surprise was total. By dawn, Patton had 6 battalions across the river. He had breached the Rhine for the cost of 28 casualties. The next morning, as Montgomery's massive operation was just beginning its thunderous overture, Patton walked across a pontoon bridge that his engineers had thrown across the river in record time. Halfway across, he stopped. In full view of his men and the cameras, he unbuttoned his trousers and urinated directly into the Rhine. It was a crude, visceral gesture of dominance, a warrior's mark on the territory of a defeated foe. He then bent down, scooped up a handful of dirt from the east bank, and let it crumble through his fingers. He sent a message to General Bradley. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across. I sneaked a division over last night. There are so few Krauts around they don't know it yet. So tell the world." The news rocked the Allied command. Patton had stolen the show again. Once across the Rhine, the Third Army tore into the heart of Germany. The resistance was sporadic but fanatical. The fanaticism, however, could not stop the momentum. Patton's tanks were now driving east, aiming for the mythical National Redoubt in the Alps and the borders of Czechoslovakia and Austria. But as the physical war rushed toward its conclusion, a new, darker reality began to emerge. The soldiers had heard rumors of the camps, whispered stories of atrocities, but nothing could prepare them for the truth. On April 4, 1945, elements of the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry Division liberated the Ohrdruf concentration camp, a sub-camp of Buchenwald. When Patton arrived on April 12th, accompanied by Generals Bradley and Eisenhower, the stench of death hit them before they even entered the gates. It was a physical wall of rot and decay. Inside, they found a shed piled high with emaciated corpses, stacked like cordwood. The bodies were skeletal, skin stretched tight over bone, eyes staring vacantly into the void. Lime had been thrown over them in a futile attempt to mask the smell. Patton, the man who had seen the worst carnage of 2 world wars, who had walked through fields of severed limbs and burning tanks without flinching, turned pale. He walked behind a barracks and violently vomited. The toughness, the ivory-handled revolvers, the scowl, all of it stripped away by the sheer scale of the industrial cruelty before him. His reaction was not just disgust. It was a cold, clarifying rage. He ordered the MPs to go into the nearby town of Ohrdruf and round up the mayor and the leading citizens. He forced them to tour the camp, to walk past the bodies, to see what their government had done in their name. The mayor and his wife, unable to live with the shame, committed suicide later that night. Patton wrote in his diary that he wanted to see the Germans suffer for this, that the Hun had lost all right to humanity. It was the moment the war ceased to be a strategic contest and became a moral imperative. By May 1945, the Third Army had penetrated deep into Austria and Czechoslovakia. They were the furthest east of any American unit. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day was declared. The guns fell silent. The cheering erupted in London, Paris, and New York. But for George Patton, the silence was not a relief. It was a sentence. He was a man built for war, a singular instrument of destruction that had no function in peace. He looked at the advancing Soviet Red Army, whom he met on the demarcation line, with deep suspicion. He famously urged Eisenhower to keep the Third Army intact, to rearm the German divisions, and to push the Soviets back to the Russian border. "We're going to have to fight them sooner or later," he argued. "Why not do it now while we're here and we're the strongest?" His political incorrectness, which had been tolerated when he was winning battles, now became a liability. He was appointed military governor of Bavaria, tasked with the denazification and reconstruction of the shattered province. But Patton had no patience for bureaucracy or the nuances of political purging. He was criticized for retaining former Nazi party members in administrative posts, arguing that he needed people who knew how to run the trains and the power plants. In a press conference in September 1945, he made a disastrous comment comparing the Nazi and anti-Nazi parties to the Democrats and Republicans in the States. The press crucified him. Eisenhower, exhausted by Patton's inability to adapt to the post-war world, relieved him of command of the Third Army. It was the final blow. Patton was transferred to the command of the 15th Army, a paper army consisting of a small headquarters staff tasked with writing the history of the war. The man who had commanded hundreds of thousands of men, who had conquered North Africa, Sicily, and France, was now a historian in uniform. He was lonely, bitter, and depressed. He wrote to his wife that he felt he was destined to die in a foreign land, that his luck had run out. He spoke of missing the bullet, the honorable death on the battlefield that he had always romanticized. On Sunday, December 9th, 1945, the day before he was scheduled to return to the United States for a leave, Patton decided to go pheasant hunting near Mannheim. He was riding in the back of his 1938 Cadillac Model 75 staff car, accompanied by his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay. The car was driven by Private First Class Horace Woodring. It was a cold, clear morning. As they drove through the ruins of post-war Germany, Patton was in a reflective mood. He pointed to the rusted hulks of vehicles on the side of the road and commented, "How awful war is. Think of the waste." At approximately 11:45 a.m., the Cadillac was driving north on Route 38. A 2.5-ton GMC military truck, driven by Technical Sergeant Robert Thompson, was approaching from the opposite direction. Suddenly, the truck made a hard left turn toward a roadside depot, cutting directly across the path of Patton's car. Woodring slammed on the brakes and swerved, but there was no room. The Cadillac collided with the truck's fuel tank at a relatively low speed, estimated at only 20 miles per hour. It was a fender bender. General Gay and the driver were shaken but unhurt. But in the back seat, Patton had been thrown forward. His head struck the glass partition separating the front and rear seats with immense force. He collapsed back onto the seat, conscious but paralyzed from the neck down. "I think I'm paralyzed," he whispered to Gay. "I can't move." He was rushed to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg. The doctors discovered that he had suffered a compression fracture of the third and fourth cervical vertebrae. His spinal cord was severely damaged. For 12 days, the Lion of the Third Army lay in a hospital bed, his body useless, trapped in a traction device. His wife Beatrice flew to his side. He tried to maintain his spirits, joking with the nurses, but the prognosis was grim. A pulmonary embolism developed, his lungs filling with fluid. On December 24, 1945, General George S. Patton, Jr. died in his sleep. He was 60 years old. The man who had survived artillery barrages, tank battles, and the wrath of his superiors was killed by a traffic accident on a quiet Sunday morning. He was buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery and Memorial in Hamm, alongside the men of the Third Army who had fallen in the Battle of the Bulge. He had requested to be buried with his men, not in Arlington. He lies there today at the head of the triangular formation of graves, facing west, eternally leading his troops. The legacy of George Patton is etched not just in the history books, but in the psyche of modern warfare. He was a complex, flawed, and often difficult man. He was capable of great cruelty and great compassion. He was a mystic who believed in reincarnation, a poet who wrote verse about the god of battles, and a profane taskmaster who drove his men to the brink of endurance. But his contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany was singular. Hitler and the German High Command feared Patton more than any other Allied general because he fought the way they had invented. He understood that, in the age of the machine, speed was the ultimate weapon. He understood that a static defense was a death sentence. By constantly moving, constantly attacking, and constantly pressing the advantage, he denied the enemy the ability to think. He turned the chaos of war into a weapon and wielded it with a ruthlessness that broke the will of the Wehrmacht. The ghost army of FUSAG was a deception, but the fear it generated was real. And when the ghost finally materialized in the hedgerows of Normandy, on the plains of France, and in the snows of the Ardennes, it proved to be more terrifying than the Germans had ever imagined. He was the indispensable man, the strategic daredevil who shortened the war by months and saved countless lives by refusing to waste time. In the end, the ghost of Patton did not just haunt the German High Command. He hunted them down, drove them into the ground, and destroyed the myth of their invincibility forever. His life ended in silence, but his echo thunders across the history of the 20th century, a reminder that in the darkest hours of conflict, victory often belongs to the bold. Would you like me to analyze another legendary commander's tactics, perhaps Rommel or Zhukov, to see how they compared to Patton? If you enjoyed this deep dive into General Patton's legendary campaigns and want to see more military history documentaries, please smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with fellow history buffs. It really helps us keep these stories alive.